Did you know that one king once declared war on the sea and had his soldiers collect seashells as spoils of battle? Or that a teenage pope turned the Vatican into a palace of sin? History remembers great rulers, but it also never forgets the terrible ones. This is Drift Off 2, where we bring calm stories for curious minds. Caligula, Rome's mad emperor. The moon once cast its silver light across the marble corridors of ancient Rome, where statues of gods watched in silence and power was measured not in years, but in whispers. Into this world, beautiful, brutal, and bound by ambition, a child was born. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but the world would remember him not for the name given at birth, but for the one given in play, Caligula, Little Boots. He was just a boy when Roman soldiers, charmed by his miniature armor and spirited grin, called him by the nickname that would one day echo through history. At their campfires, he was a symbol of hope, a spark of innocence in a hardened world, the son of Germanicus, Rome's beloved general, and Agrippina the elder, fierce and proud. A boy destined, perhaps, to inherit greatness. But destiny often plays its cruelest games with those who shine the brightest. Before Caligula reached adulthood, the golden thread of his youth was cut again and again. His father, Germanicus, died under circumstances steeped in suspicion. His enemies many, the poisoners never caught. Then his mother, accused of conspiracy. His brothers, one by one, lost to exile, execution, or silence. The family that once stood closest to the heart of Rome was carved away, all but the boy they called Little Boots. He was sent to the island of Capri, where the aging Emperor Tiberius had withdrawn from Rome. There, far from the public gaze, Caligula grew up in the shadow of power, beneath the flicker of torchlight in rooms filled with secrets. Tiberius was a man ruled by mistrust, surrounded by advisors and spies, and in that strange and bitter court, Caligula learned to wear a smile that concealed more than it revealed. He survived by becoming what those around him needed him to be: quiet, clever, compliant, but deep within, something began to fracture. The child who had once walked among soldiers began to retreat inward, carrying with him a lifetime of grief buried beneath polished charm. When Tiberius died in 37 CE, the young man who had waited in the wings emerged to take the stage. Caligula was just 24 years old, and Rome welcomed him not as a stranger, but as a son returned. The people celebrated. Statues were raised, crowds filled the forum. At last, they believed, the darkness of Tiberius had passed. For a brief while, it seemed they were right. Caligula released prisoners. He granted bonuses to the guard. He hosted feasts that filled the city with laughter and gold. The Senate offered him honor after honor. His face, once the face of a boy in boots, now adorned coins and temples. And then, as swiftly as dawn yields to dusk, the light disappeared. What changed, no one can say for certain. Some speak of a sudden illness, perhaps a fever or poison. Others believe the mask had simply slipped. Whatever the cause, when Caligula returned to public life after a period of mysterious seclusion, he was no longer the same. There was something hollow in his gaze, something unpredictable. The benevolent gestures stopped. In their place came spectacles of cruelty and indulgence. He spent the empire's wealth with a kind of fevered desperation. Palaces were built, banquets stretched for days. He declared himself divine, not metaphorically, but absolutely. Statues of Jupiter were refashioned in his image. He demanded worship, applause, fear. He mocked the Senate, replacing respect with ridicule. He humiliated Rome's noblest men in front of crowds, not out of strategy, but apparent delight. One day, he announced plans to name his horse, a favorite companion in his increasingly solitary world, a consul of Rome. Whether serious or satirical, the message was the same. Tradition meant nothing. Power was theatre, and he was the playwright. Stories from this time blur the line between reality and rumour, but even the wildest tales reflect a truth felt across the empire, that the man who ruled them now was not what he seemed. And yet, despite all this, the people said nothing. The Senate bowed deeper, the guards saluted longer. Because Caligula was not merely feared, he was unpredictable, and there is a unique kind of terror in not knowing what a tyrant might do next. In the end, it was not enemies at the border who brought his reign to a close, but those within his own walls. In January of the year 41 CE, Caligula walked the corridors of his palace unaware that death waited just around the corner. A group of Praetorian guards, those sworn to protect him, struck with swords drawn. They didn't speak. They did not hesitate. The man who once believed himself a god collapsed to the floor, pleading like any other mortal. His wife, his child, none were spared. And just like that, the shadow lifted. Rome exhaled, but the question lingered. Who had he truly been? Was Caligula a madman, broken by trauma and isolation? Or was he something more complex, a mirror reflecting the worst of Rome itself? A reminder that even the most advanced civilization can fall under the spell of spectacle and ego. His name survives not in celebration, but in caution, a symbol of how quickly the promise of greatness can give way to tragedy when power is left unchecked. So, as you close your eyes tonight and drift deeper into sleep, remember the boy they called Little Boots. Not for the madness that followed, but for the silence in between, for the child once adored by soldiers, and the man who lost his way beneath a crown too heavy to bear. Sleep well, dear dreamer. We have many stories yet to tell. Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar who ruled through fear. In the vast, snow-covered lands of Russia, where winter winds whisper across empty plains and rivers freeze beneath layers of silence, a child was born who would shape his nation through pain, paranoia, and power. His name was Ivan. The world would come to know him as Ivan the Terrible. He came into the world in the year 1530, under the domes of Moscow, where gold shimmered against the pale sky and the scent of incense lingered in cathedrals like a memory that would not fade. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, ruled over a growing realm. But when Ivan was only 3, the old prince died, and a crown too large for any child passed to his son. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, served as regent. Strong, intelligent, and protective, she tried to hold the empire together with her will alone. But 2 short years later, she too was gone, poisoned, most believe, by those who feared her strength. And so, the child Tsar was left alone in a palace filled with whispering nobles, plotting boyars, and long, cold corridors where kindness rarely passed. Ivan wasn't raised so much as endured. The nobles treated him as a figurehead, a puppet in princely robes. They controlled the court, hoarded power, and left the boy to fend for himself. Some days he was pampered with riches, others he was neglected, locked away, or beaten. Surrounded by cruelty and betrayal, he learned early that survival meant suspicion. That power, once taken, must never be shared. But Ivan was not a fool. Quietly, he observed. He read deeply, devoured histories, memorized the chronicles of ancient Rome and Byzantium. In those old empires, he saw reflections of what Russia could become, and of what he might be if ever he truly ruled. In 1547, at just 16 years old, Ivan did what no Russian ruler had done before. He crowned himself Tsar of all the Russias. Not a grand prince, not a regent, but Tsar, a title drawn from Caesar, a divine ruler, anointed not by men but by God. At first, his reign shimmered with promise. He introduced legal reforms, strengthened the military, reduced the power of the greedy boyars. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a noble woman of gentle heart and fierce mind. With her by his side, the young Tsar seemed balanced, temperate, even hopeful. Together, they built a vision of a more unified Russia. But fate, as always, waited in the wings. In 1560, Anastasia fell ill. Her death came quickly, and its shadow fell hard. Ivan was devastated. Some whispered that she had been poisoned, perhaps by jealous boyars. Whether true or not, Ivan believed it, and something inside him began to crack. Grief turned to rage, doubt turned to obsession, and Ivan, once a reformer, began to transform into something else entirely. In 1565, he created a new power, the Oprichnina, a state within the state, ruled not by law, but by fear. His personal army, the Oprichniki, dressed in black and rode black horses. Their saddles bore symbols of dogs' heads and brooms to sniff out traitors and sweep away the unworthy. They became his instruments of terror. Nobles were dragged from their homes in the night. Entire families disappeared. Lands were seized. Cities burned. Ivan's fury spared no one. Suspicion alone could mean torture, or worse. One by one, his perceived enemies vanished into the cold silence of his justice. In 1570, he turned his wrath upon the city of Novgorod, convinced it had betrayed him. What followed was a massacre. Men, women, and children were slaughtered. The river Volkhov ran red with blood. It was not war, it was punishment, and it was absolute. And still, it did not end. By the 1580s, Ivan trusted no one. He saw enemies in every shadow, even among his own blood. In 1581, in a fit of rage and suspicion, he struck his own son and heir, also named Ivan, during a heated argument. The blow was fatal. The Tsar watched his son collapse, the life spilling from his eyes, and in that moment, the weight of what he had done seemed to fall on him all at once. A howl of grief echoed through the palace. The heir was dead, the dynasty shattered, and the man once hailed as Russia's hope had become its greatest horror. Ivan ruled for another 3 years, but he was never the same, sick, broken, haunted by the ghosts of his own making. On March 18th, 1584, he died while playing chess, a quiet end for a man whose life had thundered with violence. And then, silence. He left no capable heir. Russia spiraled into what would become known as the Time of Troubles, a dark age of famine, civil war, and foreign invasion. The scars of his rule ran deep, etched not just into history books, but into the soul of a nation. Tonight, as you drift gently into sleep, consider the child behind the crown, a boy who once wandered palace halls, dreaming of being more than a pawn, a ruler who once tried to build, a man undone by fear and sorrow. Ivan the Terrible was not born terrible. He was shaped, twisted, hardened by pain until cruelty became armor, and suspicion his closest ally. His reign reminds us that even the strongest minds can break, and that the burden of rule, if not met with balance, can turn vision into vengeance. Sleep well, dear dreamer. Let the snow fall softly on Moscow tonight, and may the shadows of the past settle into silence, where they can do no more harm. King John, the king who betrayed his own crown. In the heart of medieval England, where green fields rolled beneath overcast skies and castles stood like sentinels above winding rivers, a child was born who would one day wear the crown. He was the youngest son of a mighty king and the least expected to rule. His name was John, and history would remember him not as a noble monarch, but as a tyrant whose failures carved one of the most important turning points in the story of power. John was born in 1166 to King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a union that shaped the destiny of Europe. His brothers were giants in reputation: Henry the young king, Geoffrey of Brittany, and Richard the Lionheart. Warriors, rulers, legends. John, the youngest, was left with little. His father called him Lackland, for he inherited no territory. And so, from the very beginning, John craved what others had, and perhaps felt he deserved more than he was ever given. As a young man, he was clever, calculating, and fiercely ambitious. But where his brothers inspired loyalty, John inspired doubt. While Richard led armies on crusade, John schemed behind the scenes. When Richard was imprisoned in Austria on his return, John allied himself with the French king, hoping to claim the throne before his brother could return. It didn't work. Richard was released, and John, though forgiven, had revealed something of himself to the world, a man who valued power more than loyalty. When Richard died in 1199, John finally claimed the crown. But he lacked the charisma of his brother, the strength, the leadership. The people did not cheer. They watched. The barons did not rejoice. They waited, and soon they would see what kind of king John truly was. His reign began with conflict. In France, he lost vast swaths of land, Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, territories that had belonged to his family for generations. Where Richard had defended the empire, John allowed it to unravel. The nobles grumbled, the treasury thinned. His answer was taxation, relentless and punishing. He taxed the barons, he taxed the church, he taxed the poor. Gold poured into his coffers, but goodwill drained away. He was not merely greedy, he was cruel. In 1203, his young nephew Arthur of Brittany, just a boy, was captured. Some believed Arthur had a stronger claim to the throne, and so, one night, Arthur vanished. Rumours spread that John had killed him with his own hands during a drunken rage. The River Seine, they said, hid the prince's body forever. Whether true or not, the whispers poisoned John's legacy. A king who would murder his kin could not be trusted by anyone. As the years passed, his cruelty deepened. He imprisoned nobles without trial, seized land, extorted wealth. His reign became one of suspicion and retribution. Even the church recoiled. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, John refused to accept the Pope's chosen replacement. In response, Pope Innocent III placed England under interdict, shutting down churches, suspending the sacraments, silencing the bells. For 6 long years, the kingdom was spiritually adrift. By 1215, the barons had had enough. Armed and furious, they marched on London. John, with no real support left, was forced to the negotiation table. There, in a meadow called Runnymede, a document was placed before him. It was called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It said that the king was not above the law, that he must govern with justice, that no man, not even a monarch, could act without consequence. John placed his seal upon it, but he never meant to obey. Within weeks, he had sent letters to the Pope, asking it be annulled. Civil war erupted once more. John, desperate to cling to his crown, even invited foreign mercenaries to help him crush his own people. But fate was no longer on his side. In 1216, while fleeing across the fenlands with his treasure train, he attempted to cross the tidal estuary known as the Wash. The waters rose, the wagons sank, the crown jewels and royal gold vanished into the mud, never recovered. Broken in spirit, John fell ill. Dysentery struck, and in the dark halls of Newark Castle he died, alone, despised and unmourned. He left behind a fractured kingdom, a crown weighted by shame, and a name spoken with contempt. And yet, from his failures came something extraordinary. Magna Carta, born of rebellion, would become a cornerstone of liberty. Its echoes reached far beyond England, to the founding of modern democracy, to the American Constitution, to the idea that rulers, no matter how high, must be held accountable. Tonight, as you close your eyes and sink into sleep, remember King John not only for the harm he caused, but for the truth his life revealed, that even the worst of rulers may, in their downfall, plant the seeds of something better. Sleep well, dear dreamer, for sometimes even tyrants help build the path to freedom without meaning to. Leopold II, the Butcher of the Congo. In the elegant palaces of 19th century Brussels, beneath chandeliers of crystal and portraits gilded in gold, a prince was born who would one day wear the crown of Belgium. His name was Leopold, but while he ruled a small European kingdom, his deepest ambitions reached far beyond the narrow borders of his homeland. He did not dream of Belgium, he dreamed of an empire. Leopold II became king in 1865. Belgium was young, only a few decades old, and modest in size. But Leopold was not content with a modest throne. He studied maps, watched the great powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, amass colonies across the world. He saw Africa not as a continent of peoples and nations, but as a blank space to be filled, claimed, controlled. And so, with polished words and a carefully cultivated smile, he created something unprecedented. In 1876, Leopold founded the International African Association, claiming it was a philanthropic effort to bring civilization to Central Africa. He told European leaders it would end slavery, spread Christianity, and uplift the native population. But behind this mask of nobility lay a darker truth. In 1885, at the Berlin Conference, he secured control of a vast territory in Central Africa, land 76 times larger than Belgium itself. It was named the Congo Free State, but it was not free, and it was not Belgian. It was his, Leopold's private possession, a kingdom of rivers, rainforests, and silence. Within that silence, horrors began. The Congo was rich in ivory and, more importantly, rubber. With the invention of inflatable tires, rubber became gold, and Leopold wanted all of it. But he would not mine it himself. He would not pay wages or build partnerships. Instead, he created a system of forced labor so brutal, so vast, that entire regions were turned into open-air prisons. Congolese villagers were given impossible quotas: how much rubber they must collect, how quickly they must work. If they failed, punishment was swift and unspeakable. The force publique, Leopold's private army, used violence to maintain control. Whips of twisted hippo hide, burning of villages, captured women held hostage to force the labor of men. And worst of all, hands. To prove that bullets were not wasted, soldiers were ordered to return with severed hands for every shot fired. Sometimes from the dead, sometimes not, sometimes from enemies. sometimes from children. The mutilations became a currency of cruelty, a symbol of obedience, a warning. It is estimated that 10 million people, half the population of the Congo, died under Leopold's rule, from exhaustion, disease, starvation, and murder. And for many years, the world said nothing, because the Congo was far away, and Leopold was charming. He used his profits to transform Belgium. He funded grand monuments, public parks, museums. He became known as the Builder King. His people admired him. His critics were ignored. But truth cannot remain buried forever. In time, missionaries, travelers, and a small group of brave journalists began to speak out. The most famous of them, E.D. Morel, discovered shipping logs that showed the truth. Weapons were going in, and rubber was coming out. But no payment, no trade, only theft, only suffering. With the help of allies like Roger Casement, Morel launched a campaign that shocked the world. Photographs emerged of men with missing limbs, children with empty sleeves. Villages turned to ash. The world began to see what Leopold had done. Under growing international pressure, the king was finally forced to relinquish control. In 1908, the Congo Free State was taken from him and placed under Belgian rule. But the damage was done. The rivers still carried memories. The forests still bore scars. The ghosts of millions lingered. Leopold never showed remorse. He died in 1909, surrounded by wealth. In his final act of control, he ordered that many records of the Congo administration be burned, an attempt to erase history. But history does not forget. Today, his name stands as one of the darkest in European history. Not for what he ruled, but for how he ruled it. A king who turned greed into genocide, who built fountains and gardens atop a mountain of bones. Tonight, as your mind begins to drift, imagine the quiet forests of the Congo, the sound of rain falling gently through the trees, and beneath that peaceful surface, a silence shaped by pain. A silence that still echoes even now. Let the story of Leopold II remind you that cruelty wears many faces. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it wears a crown. Sleep well, dear dreamer. There is more history to tell, and more lessons still to learn. Nero, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned. In the golden heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns rose like trees and statues lined the avenues like silent gods, a boy was born beneath the shadow of ambition. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, but in time the world would know him by a simpler name, Nero. He was born in 37 CE, during a time of imperial splendor and quiet unrest. Rome was powerful, proud, and uneasy. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a woman of noble blood and iron will, sister to Caligula, niece to Claudius. She saw in her son a pathway back to power, not just for him, but for herself. When Nero was still a child, Agrippina married the Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and convinced him to adopt Nero as heir. From that moment on, his path was paved with silk and soaked in strategy. Tutors were summoned, including the great philosopher Seneca, who tried to shape the young boy into a wise and noble ruler. The empire watched, the Senate waited. In 54 CE, Claudius died, poisoned, many believed, by Agrippina's hand, and Nero, just 17, became emperor. At first, Rome exhaled. The early years of Nero's reign were promising. He reduced taxes, improved the legal system, spoke kindly to the people. Art and music flourished. With Seneca and Burrus guiding him, the empire seemed safe. And yet, behind the golden mask, a storm was forming. Nero was no soldier. He was no statesman. He was an artist. He loved the lyre, the stage, applause. He believed he had been born to perform, not to rule. And as he grew older, the burden of the crown began to chafe. The Senate irritated him. The court exhausted him. Even his own mother, once his greatest protector, became a threat. Their bond, so carefully constructed, began to fracture. In 59 CE, Nero ordered her death. The stories say she survived the first attempt, a collapsing ceiling. She survived the second, a sabotaged boat. Finally, assassins were sent. When they arrived, Agrippina is said to have looked them in the eye and offered her womb. "Strike here," she said. And they did. With her gone, something inside Nero shifted. The man who had once governed with promise began to unravel. Paranoia crept in. Executions mounted. Senators, poets, generals, none were safe. Even his wife, Octavia, was exiled and later killed. Her head, legend says, was delivered to his second wife as a gift. And then came the fire. In July of the year 64, flames swept through Rome. For 6 days, the city burned. Temples crumbled. Homes collapsed. Smoke curled into the sky like a shroud. Thousands were left homeless, desperate, afraid. And in the chaos, a rumor began to spread that Nero had stood atop a tower, watching the city burn, singing of the fall of Troy. There is no proof he played the lyre as Rome was consumed, but truth mattered little. The image had already taken hold. Nero, the artist emperor. Nero, the destroyer. Nero, who lit the fire himself so that he could rebuild the city in his image. In an attempt to deflect blame, he pointed his finger at a small, misunderstood group, the Christians. He declared them enemies of the state, and in the gardens of his palace, they were crucified, burned alive, torn apart by beasts, martyrs, born of imperial fear. But Nero's own end was not far behind. As the years passed, his popularity with the people faded. His finances dwindled. His court turned cold. Rebellions rose in the provinces. The Senate declared him an enemy of the state. Hunted, abandoned, and desperate, Nero fled Rome in disguise, hiding in a villa outside the city. There, in the early hours of June 9th, 68 CE, he heard the sound of horses approaching. Soldiers had come. There would be no trial, no mercy. And so, with shaking hands, Nero pressed a dagger to his throat. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered, and was gone. He was just 30 years old. Nero's death marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. In the vacuum that followed, civil war erupted, known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Rome, once so stable, teetered on the edge. And the man who had once dreamed of singing on stage left behind a legacy of fire and fear. But was he truly evil, or simply lost? Nero was not born a tyrant. He was shaped by ambition, isolation, and expectation. A boy who wanted to perform, but was told to command. A man who reached for music, but found blood instead. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let his story echo softly in your mind, not as condemnation, but as reflection on the dangers of unchecked power, the loneliness of rule, and the haunting truth that even the most powerful can feel utterly alone. Sleep well, dear dreamer. More stories lie ahead. Pope John XII, the sinful Pope. In the ancient city of Rome, where once emperors wore crowns of laurel and armies marched beneath marble arches, a new kind of power had taken root. No longer seated in palaces, it now rested in the grand halls of churches. The popes, successors of St. Peter, held not swords, but blessings, not kingdoms, but the souls of men. But even sacred robes can hide scandal. and not all who wear the keys of St. Peter carry them with care. This is the story of Pope John XII, a pontiff so young, so reckless, and so wildly corrupt that even in an age of chaos, he shocked the Christian world. He was born Octavianus, a noble of the powerful Tusculani family, lords of the Roman hills, rich in land and influence. In the mid-10th century, Rome was a city of tension, the Holy Roman Empire to the north, warring aristocrats to the south, and in between the church, both sacred and political, both holy and deeply human. Octavian's father was Alberic II, ruler of Rome, not a pope, but the power behind the papal throne. As he approached death, Alberic sought to ensure that both the spiritual and secular realms remained in his family's grasp. And so, at just 16 years old, Octavian was elected pope. The year was 955, and almost immediately the boy pontiff made Rome tremble. He took the name John XII, stepping into the shoes of saints, prophets, and martyrs. But instead of prayers, there were parties. Instead of scripture, seduction. The Lateran Palace, seat of papal authority, was said to resemble less a house of God and more a den of vice. Chroniclers, some biased, others stunned, claimed that John turned the Vatican into a brothel, that he gambled, that he drank to excess, that he invoked pagan gods in jest, that he committed acts more fitting of a wayward prince than a shepherd of souls. One writer, shocked beyond expression, simply described his papacy as a disgrace to the chair of Peter. But it was not just personal conduct. John's failures extended to the realm of politics. Surrounded by enemies, he sought an alliance with the German king Otto I, a ruler strong enough to protect him, but ambitious enough to demand something in return. In 962, John crowned Otto as Holy Roman Emperor, reviving an ancient title that bound church and state together once more. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. Soon after, distrust began to grow between them. John feared Otto's influence. Otto questioned John's morality. The emperor returned to Rome, summoned a council, and accused the pope of perjury, murder, and sacrilege. John, unwilling to appear, was deposed. In his place, Leo VIII was appointed, but John was not gone. While Leo ruled with Otto's backing, John gathered his allies. And when the emperor left the city, John returned with force. Leo fled. The streets ran with blood. And once more, John XII sat on the papal throne. But not for long. In 964, just a few months after his violent return, John XII died unexpectedly. The cause? Unclear. Some say he suffered a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Others speak of a jealous husband's revenge. Whether divine judgment or mortal consequence, the result was the same. Rome had rid itself of a pope whose reign blurred the line between the sacred and the profane. He was no reformer, no martyr, no teacher of peace, and yet his story endures. A caution, perhaps, that power, spiritual or otherwise, is no guarantee of virtue, that youth and arrogance can corrupt even the most revered of offices, that holiness, once hollowed out by vanity, leaves behind only echoes. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, let the bells of ancient Rome toll softly in your mind. Hear them not as condemnation, but as a reminder that even those who wear the robes of the divine are still, at heart, human, fallible, fragile. Sleep well, dear dreamer. The night is long, and many tales still remain. Richard II, the fallen Plantagenet. There is a strange beauty in England's ancient past, mist curling through castle ramparts, tapestries of war and peace woven together in stone and silence. Among the many kings who walked those grey halls, few fell as quietly and as completely as Richard II. He was born in 1367 at the royal palace of Bordeaux, a son of the House of Plantagenet, heir to centuries of rule. His father was the gallant Edward, the Black Prince, a warrior of legend feared across France. But Richard was no soldier's son in spirit. His heart beat to softer rhythms. When his father died, Richard was still a child. At just 10 years old, he became king, a boy with golden curls and thoughtful eyes, draped in robes far too heavy for shoulders so young. The realm was governed by councils. His uncle, John of Gaunt, held much of the true power, but the child king watched and learned. In 1381, the first test came. That summer, the fields of England stirred with unrest. Poor workers, angry at unfair taxes and cruel laws, rose up in rebellion. They marched on London in a fury of pitchforks and protest. Their leader, Wat Tyler, demanded change. For a moment, the kingdom hung by a thread, and it was Richard, only 14, who met them. He rode out to face the rebels, calm and composed, and spoke with words beyond his years. "You shall have no captain but me," he told them. It worked. The mob dissolved. The danger passed. For a fleeting moment, the boy king was a hero. But time has a way of revealing deeper truths. As Richard grew, so did his confidence and his need for control. He surrounded himself with favourites, men the nobles distrusted, men who whispered not of justice, but of flattery. He believed in divine kingship, not just in ceremony, but in truth, that God had chosen him, that all others were beneath his wisdom. He began to rule not as a guardian, but as a god. In 1387, the Lords Appellant, powerful nobles fed up with his excess, rose against him. Civil conflict loomed, but Richard survived. He bided his time. And when his moment came, he struck. His enemies were arrested, exiled, or executed. The young king, once patient, now ruled with cold resolve. He commissioned paintings of himself in majesty. He passed laws that declared it treason to even imagine harm against him. Parliament bent, the courts obeyed, but the people, they grew distant. His expenses rose, his circle tightened. The realm, once proud, now murmured in discontent. Then, in 1399, came the fatal blow. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt, had been exiled by Richard. But when John died, Richard seized his lands instead of passing them to Henry. It was a dangerous move. Henry returned, not just to reclaim his birthright, but to claim the crown. And Richard, so sure of his divinity, so wrapped in ceremony and silence, did nothing. While Henry rallied support, Richard hesitated. He returned from Ireland too late, found himself isolated, abandoned. He was arrested without resistance. The king who once held court in splendour was now a prisoner in the Tower of London. He was forced to abdicate. His robes were stripped, the sceptre taken from his hand, the crown, once his divine symbol, placed in another's grasp. Henry was crowned. King Henry IV. The Plantagenet line continued, but not through Richard. He died in captivity a year later. Some say of starvation, others say by murder. Buried without ceremony in a small grave, only to be reinterred years later beside his beloved queen. But his legacy lived on. In Shakespeare's telling, he became poetry, a tragic figure full of beauty and broken pride, a man who mistook divine right for leadership, who thought that kingship came not with duty, but with destiny. Tonight, as you close your eyes, let Richard's story rest softly on your mind, not as a caution alone, but as a reflection. For even those born into greatness must listen, must learn, must lead not with ego, but with care. Sleep well, dear dreamer, the next king waits in the wings, and not all wear their crown with grace. Charles VI, the king who thought he was made of glass. The halls of medieval France were filled with splendour, stained glass windows catching the morning sun, soft tapestries muffling the stone walls, banners fluttering in the breeze. But within those opulent courts, one king walked slowly, carefully, as if every step might break him. His name was Charles VI, and in time his subjects would call him Charles the Mad. He was born in 1368 into the grand house of Valois. France was a realm of beauty and blood, locked in a long war with England, shaken by plague, and ruled by young kings who came to power too soon. Charles ascended the throne at just 11 years old. The crown was heavy, but his advisors, his uncles, ruled in his name. The kingdom carried on, and when Charles came of age, hope returned. He was handsome, cultured, beloved by his people. He lowered taxes, dismissed greedy officials, brought peace to the court. They called him Charles the Beloved. For a time, France smiled again, but peace can be a fragile thing. In 1392, without warning, something inside the young king cracked. While leading a military expedition, Charles suddenly turned on his own men. Sword drawn, eyes wild, he attacked his companions in a violent frenzy, killing some, wounding others, until he was restrained. When it ended, he remembered nothing. The court was shaken. Whispers began. It was not an isolated episode. In the years that followed, Charles would drift in and out of lucidity like a boat lost on a tide. Sometimes he was coherent, gentle, apologetic, thoughtful. Other times, unreachable. He would not know his wife. He would forget his children. He could sit for hours, unmoving, staring at nothing. Then, without warning, cry out in terror, convinced he was under attack by invisible foes. And then there was the glass. One of his most curious delusions was that he believed his body was made of glass. He wore iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect his limbs. He forbade anyone to touch him. He moved delicately, as if a single jolt might shatter him into pieces. He would not sit on chairs without pillows. He panicked if anyone approached too quickly. To be king, and believe yourself breakable, what torment that must have been. The court struggled to cope. Governance fell into the hands of competing nobles. France fractured into rival factions, Burgundians, Armagnacs, foreign alliances. Betrayals whispered through corridors. The 100 Years' War reignited, and all the while, Charles drifted in and out, a ghost in his own palace. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, tried to hold things together. So did his advisors, but the realm needed a king, and the king could no longer hold his crown with steady hands. His illness lasted for decades, and yet he lived, not for 5 years, or 10, but 42, a king in name, a shadow in soul, a man trapped not in chains, but in a mind that no longer obeyed him. He died in 1422, at the age of 53. His reign had seen France divided, Paris occupied, and Joan of Arc not yet risen. The land mourned, but it also sighed with relief. Today, historians speculate. Perhaps it was schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder, or a severe neurological condition. We may never know. But what we do know is this: Charles was not cruel. He was not corrupt. He was not evil. He was ill. Profoundly, tragically ill. And that makes his story not one of tyranny, but of deep, aching sorrow. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy, let Charles's tale settle softly around you. a reminder that kings are not immune to suffering, that the mind, so vast and complex, can be both a crown and a curse, and that even those who wear velvet and gold may feel as fragile as glass. Sleep well, dear dreamer. The pages of history turn slowly and gently. Rudolf II, the alchemist emperor. High upon a hill in Prague, where the city's cobbled streets curl like tendrils through history, there once stood a castle filled with mysteries. Its chambers echoed not with war cries, but with whispers of science, starlight, and sorcery. Inside, behind doors painted with astrological signs and locked drawers of rare minerals, lived an emperor unlike any other. His name was Rudolf II. He was born in 1552 into the powerful Habsburg dynasty, an empire so vast it stretched from the snowy peaks of Austria to the golden plains of Spain. His childhood was spent in splendor, but also in shadows. He was sent to Spain as a boy, to the austere court of Philip II, where silence was rule and joy was rare. There, under the weight of rigid Catholic devotion and suffocating tradition, Rudolf began to retreat inward. When he returned to Central Europe, he was not a warrior. He was not a preacher. He was something else entirely. He became Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1576, a title grander in name than in power. His kingdom was fractured, dozens of princes, cities, and faiths pulling in opposite directions, and Rudolf did not try to tame them. Instead, he looked to the heavens. He moved his court to Prague, not the political heart of his empire, but the spiritual one. There, he surrounded himself with scholars and dreamers. He invited astronomers, philosophers, painters, poets, mystics. He built libraries filled with ancient manuscripts. Cabinets of curiosity overflowed with bones, fossils, and mechanical wonders. Art adorned every surface. Telescopes lined the towers. Among his guests were some of the greatest minds of the age. Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer with his golden nose, mapped the stars from Rudolf's observatories. Johannes Kepler, quiet and precise, worked under his patronage, laying the groundwork for the laws of planetary motion. Giordano Bruno, philosopher and heretic, passed through his orbit. So too did painters, alchemists, and madmen. Rudolf believed in the mystical and the measurable. He thought that metals might be transformed into gold, that the stars influenced human fate, that the divine could be glimpsed through careful study. He poured fortunes into the search for the philosopher's stone, not for greed, but for the promise of truth, the unity of all things. But while his court glittered with knowledge, his mind darkened. Rudolf suffered from deep and growing melancholy. He became reclusive, unpredictable. Days passed where he would not rise, months where decisions were left unanswered. He feared assassination, feared betrayal, feared his own family. His brothers whispered, plots brewed, and in time they acted. In 1608, his younger brother Matthias seized control of much of the empire. Rudolf, isolated in Prague, was left only with the title of emperor and a shadow of authority. Even Bohemia, his beloved stronghold, slipped through his fingers. By 1611, he was forced to abdicate completely. He died the following year, alone in a castle once filled with laughter and light. His legacy is strange, complex, bittersweet. He was a poor ruler, yes. He neglected politics. He let his empire drift. But he was also a patron of one of Europe's most magical cultural renaissances. Under his roof, science and superstition danced together. Art flourished. Ideas sparked. And the stars were never more carefully watched. Tonight, as your thoughts grow still, Picture the skyline of old Prague under the velvet dome of night. Lanterns flickering, towers reaching, and in a quiet chamber, a solitary man tracing constellations with a trembling hand, trying to understand the secrets of the universe before his mind slipped too far away. Let Rudolf's story remind you that greatness does not always take the form of conquest. That brilliance can burn from within, even if it fades in solitude. Sleep well, dear dreamer. More emperors await, but none quite like this one. Emperor Yang of Sui, the builder who lost everything. Long ago, in the lands where mist coils through rice paddies and mountains stretch like dragons sleeping beneath the sky, a man once ruled with a vision so vast it could shape rivers. He dreamed of uniting all things: roads, trade, armies, hearts. He wished to build not only monuments but memory. His name was Yang Guang, known to history as Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty. He was born into privilege in the year 569 CE, a prince of the newly formed Sui Empire. His father, Emperor Wen, was a careful man, disciplined, austere, devout. But Yang was different, handsome, clever, ambitious beyond measure. He understood charm and ceremony. He knew how to bend people with words rather than weapons. When the time came, he was named heir. Some say he earned it. Others whisper of darker means, that he manipulated, even murdered, to clear the path to the throne. Whatever the truth, he became emperor in 604 CE, and almost immediately he began to build. Yang saw the empire as a body, and himself as the heartbeat. But a body cannot move without veins, and so he ordered the construction of the Grand Canal, an enormous project linking the fertile lands of the south with the imperial capital in the north. Thousands of miles of water carved by human hands. Barges gliding where once there was only soil. Rice, silk, and spices flowing like blood between distant provinces. It was an astonishing achievement, but it came at a terrible cost. Millions of labourers were conscripted. Many were farmers, pulled from their fields, their homes, their families. The work was brutal, the deaths uncounted. Under the summer sun and the winter frost, they dug and toiled, and when they collapsed, others stepped in. The project continued, yet Yang was not finished. He built new palaces, enormous glittering halls, to rival any in the world. He expanded the Great Wall. He launched 3 campaigns to conquer Goguryeo, the Korean kingdom to the northeast. Each campaign was massive. Each one ended in disaster. Soldiers froze in the mountains. Ships sank. Supplies ran dry. And still, he pressed forward. The people grew weary, his officials resentful. The treasury bled gold. The empire, once unified, began to crack. But Yang did not hear the warnings, or perhaps he chose not to. He held parades of unimaginable splendor. He traveled in processions so vast that entire cities were forced to empty their stores just to feed his entourage. He believed in image, in legacy, in the greatness of his name carved into stone, no matter the cost in flesh. And then the rebellion came. It began with whispers, then with skirmishes. Soon, full uprisings flared across the land. The people had had enough. The generals who once bowed now broke ranks. Yang fled the capital, seeking refuge in the south. But there was nowhere left to run. In 618 CE, at a remote palace in the city of Chengdu, his own men turned against him. The emperor, who had once commanded millions, was found strangled in the night, silent, cold, alone. His reign, like his dreams, brought low by excess. The dynasty died with him, and yet his canal remained. Even today, over 1,000 years later, the Grand Canal of China is still in use. Barges glide across it, crops travel north, goods flow south. His empire is gone, but the veins he carved through the land still carry life. So how shall we remember him? As a tyrant, blind to suffering, or as a visionary, consumed by his own ambition? Perhaps both. Tonight, as the world outside your window grows still, imagine the quiet waters of the canal reflecting the stars. Picture the oars dipping gently into the current, the whisper of wind in bamboo groves, the hush of 1,000 footsteps long since vanished. Let the story of Emperor Yang remind you that what we build often outlives us, but how we build it, that too is remembered. Sleep well, dear dreamer. Another crown waits to be lifted, or to fall. Sultan Ibrahim, the madman of the Ottoman harem. He was born Ibrahim, a prince of the mighty Ottoman dynasty, but from his earliest years he was not raised to lead. He was hidden, kept in the cafes, the cage, a secluded wing of the palace where potential heirs were confined to prevent civil war. The practice spared lives, but at a cost. It bred solitude, anxiety, madness. Ibrahim spent the first 20 years of his life in this lonely cage, uncertain whether he would live to see the next sunrise. Each time the footsteps of guards echoed outside his chamber, he feared it was his last. His brothers, one by one, were executed at the order of their ruling sibling, a grim tradition meant to eliminate threats to the throne. He survived only because no one believed he would ever rule, but fate had other plans. In 1640, when his older brother Murad IV died without a son, Ibrahim was the last male heir. He emerged blinking into the sunlight, dazed, fragile, and deeply unprepared. And so began one of the strangest reigns in Ottoman history. At first, he ruled in name only. Real power rested in the hands of his mother, Kusum Sultan, one of the most powerful women the empire had ever known. She managed affairs of state while Ibrahim lingered in the harem, overwhelmed by the outside world. Soon, though, he began to indulge. He became obsessed with physical pleasures, lavish banquets, ornate costumes, rare perfumes. He demanded concubines not just for beauty, but for novelty. One infamous story tells of his obsession with a single woman of extraordinary size, whom he titled Sheikh of the Sea. He showered her with jewels and elevated her to extraordinary rank within the palace. But it was not only indulgence that defined his rule, it was paranoia. Ibrahim feared plots against him. He had once lived on the edge of a blade. He had not forgotten. In moments of rage, he turned on his advisors, ordering executions for imagined betrayals. He emptied the treasury to fund his whims. Gold flowed through the palace like water, and resentment followed close behind. One of his most troubling acts came when he ordered the execution of hundreds of palace concubines, believing they had been disloyal. The calm courtyards of the harem, once places of laughter, music, and quiet rivalry, were transformed into places of fear. The empire, meanwhile, suffered. Corruption rose, trade faltered. Military campaigns failed. The people grew restless. Eventually, even the Sultan's protectors could no longer protect him. In 1648, after just 8 years on the throne, the Janissaries, elite soldiers once sworn to serve him, rebelled. They arrested the Sultan and deposed him. He was confined once again, not in a gilded cage, but a true prison. A few days later, he was strangled with a silken cord. The executioners, dressed in silence, did what the empire believed had to be done. He was 33 years old, and thus ended the reign of Ibrahim, the Sultan born in shadow, raised in fear, and consumed by the very world he was never meant to rule. Some say he was mad, others believe he was simply broken, shaped by trauma and isolation into something no longer whole. Tonight, as your breath slows and your mind wanders gently toward dreams, think of the marble halls of Topkapi Palace, of empty chambers where footsteps once echoed in fear, of the soft rustle of silk curtains hiding eyes from the world, and of a man who held the might of an empire in his hands and never truly understood it. Let his story be a quiet reminder that power, without grounding, without preparation, without compassion, can become a prison far colder than any cage. Sleep well, dear dreamer. Our journey through broken crowns continues. Ludwig II of Bavaria, the dream king who lost his way. High in the pine-covered hills of Bavaria, where fog clings to mountain tops and castle spires pierce the morning mist, a young man once stood at the threshold of fantasy and power. His name was Ludwig, and though he wore a crown, his heart longed not for conquest or courtly debate, but for music, solitude, and dreams. Born in 1845 into the royal house of Wittelsbach, Ludwig came of age in a palace by a quiet lake. Even as a child, he seemed distant, more drawn to poetry and myth than politics or discipline. He read stories of swan knights and sleeping kings, wandered the forest alone, and imagined a world far removed from the court his family governed. At 18, following the sudden death of his father, Ludwig was crowned King of Bavaria. His people hoped he would rule with wisdom and strength, but Ludwig had no taste for statecraft. He avoided ministers, he retreated from public life, and in time he withdrew almost entirely into his imagination. He found a companion of sorts in the composer Richard Wagner. To Ludwig, Wagner's operas were more than music, they were revelations, tales of tragic heroes, sacred mountains, lost gods. He funded Wagner's works extravagantly, built theatres for his performances, and referred to him as the voice of German myth. Their relationship, complicated and intense, drew whispers from the court and concern from the treasury. When Wagner's presence became too controversial, Ludwig reluctantly exiled him, only to pine for his return. But Ludwig didn't stop at music. He began to construct palaces that defied practicality. Towers and halls drawn not from blueprints, but from stories. He imagined Bavarian castles in the style of medieval legend, filled with winding staircases, hidden passages, and muraled walls depicting scenes of Norse gods, holy grails, and tragic kings. The most famous, Neuschwanstein, rose like a dream from the mountainside, designed not as a seat of power, but as a retreat from reality. The expenses grew staggering. Ministers pleaded with him to stop, but Ludwig ignored them. He built Linderhof, a smaller palace of mirrors and moonlit fountains. Then Herrenchiemsee, a homage to Versailles, constructed on an island in the middle of a lake. He rarely entertained guests. These places were for him alone, private stages where the burdens of rule could dissolve into fantasy. As time passed, Ludwig withdrew even further. He became nocturnal, roaming the corridors of his castles long after midnight. Servants were ordered not to look him in the eye. Meals were taken in silence. He commissioned operas that no one would hear and filled his days with correspondence about art, architecture, and dreams that would never be realized. He left state affairs unattended, and Bavaria, increasingly drawn into the rising German Empire, drifted under the influence of others. In 1886, it came to an end. The government, alarmed by his spending and withdrawal, declared Ludwig insane. The decision was made in haste, signed by doctors who had never examined him in person. That evening, he was arrested at Neuschwanstein and taken to Berg Castle, where he wept and begged, but did not resist. The next day, he took a walk with one of the attending physicians, Dr. Bernhard von Guden. Hours later, both were found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. The exact circumstances remain a mystery. He was just 40 years old. His castles still stand, visited by millions each year. Neuschwanstein, once mocked as the fantasy of a madman, is now one of the most iconic palaces in the world, a monument not to power, but to longing. Ludwig left no heir, no dynasty, no legacy of war or diplomacy, only beauty and sorrow. Tonight, as the stars shimmer softly above the mountain lakes of Bavaria, let your thoughts drift to those silent towers, to the echo of footsteps on polished stone, to the king who built palaces not for his people, but for his solitude, a dreamer who wore a crown and could not bear the weight of waking life. Sleep well, dear dreamer, the final crown awaits. Tiberius, the emperor who watched from the shadows. Long before the fall of Rome, long before the names of emperors were etched in ruin, there was a man who ruled not with fire and thunder, but with silence. A man whose reign drifted like a fog over the eternal city, heavy, watchful, and unknowable. His name was Tiberius, and history remembers him not as a tyrant of chaos, but as one of cold retreat, a ruler who vanished into shadows and ruled from behind a curtain of fear. He was born in 42 BCE, the stepson of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the man who had transformed a republic into an empire. Tiberius was raised among marble pillars and military tents, surrounded by the weight of expectation. He was no fool. He was intelligent, capable, and brave. A skilled general who led successful campaigns in Germania and the East. But he was also deeply private, uncomfortable with the theatre of power, and scarred by the politics of Rome's elite. He was not Augustus's first choice for heir, nor even the second, but death and misfortune cleared the path. One by one, others were removed, some by nature, others by quieter means, and Tiberius found himself standing alone at the edge of destiny. In the year 14 CE, Augustus died, and Tiberius became emperor. The Senate confirmed him. The legions swore their loyalty, and Rome watched, uncertain what kind of ruler he would be. At first, he governed with caution. He maintained Augustus's reforms, paid attention to the treasury, and resisted the lure of lavish games and empty flattery. Some hoped he would continue the Golden Age, but beneath his calm exterior, something darker stirred. He distrusted the Senate. He mistrusted the people. He saw enemies in every corridor. And slowly, step by step, he began to pull away from public life. The turning point came with personal grief. His beloved son, Drusus, died under suspicious circumstances. Tiberius never recovered from the loss. Whether it was grief, paranoia, or something deeper, the emperor began to withdraw from Rome itself. He left the city, retreating first to villas in the countryside, and then, finally, to the island of Capri. There, surrounded by steep cliffs and turquoise sea, Tiberius built a palace complex high above the water. It was both a sanctuary and a fortress. Visitors were rarely allowed. Letters were his only voice. He ruled the Roman Empire from afar, issuing commands through intermediaries, his face rarely seen, his thoughts even more rarely understood. Rumors filled the silence. Some said he filled his days with cruel pleasures, feeding darker appetites beyond the gaze of Rome. Others claimed he walked the cliffs alone, mumbling to ghosts. None could say for sure. What was known, however, was the growing reign of terror that shadowed his final years. In his absence, a man named Sejanus, head of the Praetorian Guard, rose to power. With Tiberius's trust, he controlled the court, but Sejanus was not loyal. He began to plot, to position himself for total control. When Tiberius finally discovered the betrayal, he acted with swift, silent violence. Sejanus was arrested during a Senate meeting and executed the same day. His allies were hunted down. The purges that followed were ruthless. Rome, under Tiberius, became a city of informants. Trials for treason multiplied. Senators feared to speak. Poets wrote with caution. Families whispered behind closed doors. And all the while, the emperor remained on Capri, distant and unmoved. He died in 37 CE at the age of 78. Some say he passed peacefully. Others believe he was suffocated by his successor, Caligula, to speed the transition of power. Whether death came by nature or ambition, the empire moved on, relieved perhaps that the shadow had finally lifted. Tiberius left no monuments, no great conquests, no triumphant legacy. And yet, he ruled for over 2 decades, longer than most Roman emperors. His silence shaped a generation. His fear shaped an empire. Tonight, as the hush of evening deepens, imagine the cliffs of Capri under moonlight, the sound of waves far below, a solitary figure gazing out to sea, holding the weight of the world, but unwilling to be seen by it. Let Tiberius's story remind you that tyranny does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides. Sleep well, dear dreamer. The crowns have passed, the kings have spoken, and the silence of history now welcomes your rest. And so, dear dreamer, our journey comes to an end. We have wandered through the palaces and prisons of kings, through candlelit halls and crumbling thrones, through voices raised in triumph, and silence left behind in shame. From marble empires to misty mountain castles, we have seen how power can elevate, and how it can corrupt, how crowns can weigh heavy on the heads that wear them, and how history remembers not only greatness, but failure too. But these were not just tyrants and madmen. They were sons, brothers, dreamers, wounded souls shaped by fear, obsession, grief, and fate. Some ruled with cruelty, others drifted into delusion. Some burned too bright, others disappeared into shadow. And though their names are carved in stone, their humanity remains. Fragile, flawed, and familiar. Perhaps that is why we return to their stories, not for spectacle, but for reflection, to understand how thin the line truly is between power and peace, between ambition and ruin. Now, the torches have dimmed, the halls are empty, the crowns have been set down, and all that remains is stillness. Thank you for walking with us through the long corridors of time. May you sleep gently, wrapped not in gold or velvet, but in quiet. May your dreams carry you far from the weight of kingdoms, into a place where peace reigns. This is Drift Off 2, where we bring calm stories for curious minds. Good night.